Welcome to this recording of the Activist Lawyer podcast, brought to you from the Granite Podcast Studio in the heart of Newry City. We are delighted that you could join us at Activist Lawyer, where we will be discussing a range of topical matters engaging not only with lawyers, but people who are committed to highlighting and combating injustices and inequalities. We will bring you our thoughts, but invite you to share yours. We'll be looking for contributors to our blog at activistlawyer.com, as we want your perspective as we unravel and unpack a host of issues. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm a solicitor practicing in Newry City. I worked with a human rights firm in Dublin for many years and with a number of rights-based organisations and charities. I'm looking forward to meeting some fantastic guests throughout this series. Today we're discussing abortion, and just by way of introduction, abortion in Ireland and the island of Ireland has always been a contentious matter. Law students will be familiar with its journey, one which has brought to the fore rather raw, emotional and deeply personal issues affecting women. I remember first learning about abortion in secondary school, albeit a very biased narrative, before moving on to study the various cases as a student in NUI Galway. The Miss P case in particular stands out for me. Then moving on to learn about lived travesties and tragedies that happened as a result of the 8th Amendment in the Republic of Ireland, like the Savita Halappanavar case, who of course died from septicemia at University Hospital Galway. Her family believed she would still be alive if a termination on medical grounds had have been allowed. Religion played a prominent role in that case. It was 2012. I later went on to work on the Repeal the 8th campaign and attended the Count in Ballsbridge in May 2018. It really felt like being part of history. But coming home to Newry on the train that day, I recalled the placards and chants after the win. What about the North? And don't forget about the North. Well, today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Eileen Fagan. Hi Eileen, thanks for coming in
Sarah.
today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. We are here on a lovely sunny Friday in the Granite Podcast Studio here in Granite Exchange Building. Just a little introduction for our listeners. Eileen Fagan has lectured in law for 15 years in leading institutions such as Oxford University and Queen's University Belfast. She has also trained women's and non-governmental organisations, medical and legal professionals worldwide. Eileen has a wealth of experience in conducting research and writing in the fields of law, politics, education and women's empowerment. She is also only one of 2 BBC Academy trained experts in the field of law. She's contributed her expertise to BBC television and radio programmes on current affairs and ethics across the UK since 2006. She was one of 25 out of 2,200 applicants chosen to participate in the BBC's Expert Women's Day in 2013. Legal analyst, BBC expert commentator, medical law and ethics, human rights, equality and education expert. We are delighted to have you here today, Eileen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I touched very briefly and very basically there just on my experience in, becoming familiar with the developments around abortion, primarily in the Republic of Ireland, having lived there and worked there for many years. Moved recently enough back home to the north, and I think you'd probably agree, it's hard to talk about the 2 jurisdictions in isolation when it comes to abortion, and I'd say one watches the other in terms of its development. And the 2018 Repeal the 8th win for the Yes campaign probably had, quite a strong impact in the north. So maybe just for our listeners as well, Eileen, and your commentary, you might bring us through a little bit of the kind of the background in terms of the law on abortion in Northern Ireland.
Well, up until the 31st of March 2020, this year, Northern Ireland, like the Republic, had some of the most restrictive abortion laws in the world. Now, Sarah, you talked about your personal experience of when you first got interested in the topic. I was 22 years of age, just turned 22, and I was at Queen's University studying law. And I was studying women's rights. And a professor said to me, what do you think of the case in the south of Ireland where the 14-year-old rape victim was prevented from leaving the jurisdiction? And I'd been raised in a Catholic school environment, and I went, I'm not interested in that topic. I don't want to deal with that, is what I said.
Yeah.
And he said to me, you're studying women's rights in Ireland and you don't want to know about this case? And he challenged me. His name was Professor Simon Lee. And he challenged me because I didn't want to deal with it.
Yes.
I had 22 years of an upbringing in my family, in my church, in my schools, and I did not want to go near the topic. I was about to graduate in law, and this is going to taint me to talk about it. But the challenge the gauntlet was laid down, and he was the lecturer in philosophy of law. So I had to look at this issue, and I was shocked. Mm-hmm. I was shocked that the state had the power to prevent someone leaving the country at that stage to have a termination when they were the child victim of rape.
Yeah.
And I think that's when the country was shocked as well, because I think most people, if it doesn't affect them and it's not in their face and it's not their daughter, it's not their sister, it's not their girlfriend, their wife, they don't want to know. Mm-hmm. So where I'm coming from, I just wanted to share that with you. Mm-hmm. That's what got me involved, was like it wouldn't go away. The topic wouldn't go away. And the reason the topic wouldn't go away is because the topic itself is two topics. Mm-hmm. It's the topic about specific issue of abortion and accessing abortion legally or illegally and the consequences. But there's a bigger topic, and that is the position of women in that society. Mm-hmm. And I continued to work on it because of the two aims. Yeah. But even if you're not interested and if you don't care, the topic is a measure, it's a litmus test of the power of the state. Now, most people don't want the state to have that much power over them when it comes to other things, like the treatment of their child in a medical situation. Most people, there's a lot of people who don't want the state to have power over them in wearing a mask.
Yeah.
So during a pandemic, so really, I wanted to put that in there.
Yeah,
I wanted to put in there. The topic of abortion is a smaller topic within a bigger topic, and that topic is the power of the state over your intimate health and life choices. So going back, both jurisdictions, North and South, had almost a complete ban on abortion. The UK, the GB, that is England, Scotland and Wales, in 1967 got the Abortion Act, which laid out 4 circumstances in which there was an exception to that ban. Northern Ireland never got it. The Republic never had it. So what Northern Ireland did have from 1861 until this year were a selection of cases which had been taken to court. Some of them were criminal cases against the defendant doctor. One in 1939 who'd performed an abortion on a 14-year-old, much like the 14-year-old in the X case in the Republic of Ireland when I was 22.
Yeah.
And he basically was inviting prosecution, and the jury did not convict him because he was trying to save the life of that girl and prevent her from being a physical and mental wreck. They said it was an exception to the complete ban. So Northern Ireland from 1939 had this law. There was an exception if a person could be a physical and mental wreck for having to continue the pregnancy. Back in 2001, the Family Planning Association in Northern Ireland took a judicial review case saying there's not much clarity in what constitutes a physical and mental wreck. Can you give us some clarity? Because the big issue in Northern Ireland was, even though there was an exception at common law, which means judge-made law in a case, doctors weren't clear about what that meant. Women weren't clear about what that meant. Practitioners, nurses. So in the 2000s, this is just a brief history, in the 2000s, there were several cases in Northern Ireland with the Family Planning Association where the judges said the pregnancy could be legally terminated if there was a risk of serious, adverse, long-term or permanent risk to the woman's health, or meaning physical or mental, and obviously the woman's life. But the problem was, again, because the 1861 Act had life imprisonment as its sanction, doctors were afraid to even follow that. So the problem in Northern Ireland was we had exceptions. Until 2003, we weren't actually sure what they meant.
There was no clarity.
There still was no clarity because the Family Planning Association asked the Department of Health to issue guidance. But every time it did issue guidance in the 2000s, it was knocked down
Yeah.
It was knocked down by the Assembly, which was operating for a while.
Who used the exceptions to, to their advantage, in that, like, it wasn't a total ban. These are the exceptions.
Yes.
But as you dig into it there, I
Yeah.
mean, in reality,
The
exist.
guidance was issued several times and withdrawn. Now, the really interesting thing, I was an academic publishing on this, is the 2013 guidance wrote in things to the law that were not there before, requiring 2 medical practitioners to verify that the woman would suffer long-term serious physical and mental health consequences. That wasn't in the original case or the law. So basically the departmental guidance was adding bits in. So just to clarify where we were before the recent reform, which I'll talk about in a minute, we had this common law terminology of serious long-term adverse consequences on a woman's physical or mental health. But we had very few doctors willing to interpret that. Number one, because the legislation did say if you get it wrong, you can go to prison for life.
Absolute fear.
And the second reason was the departmental guidance issued was very threatening in terms of its language. So basically, the Family Planning Association strategy of clarifying the law backfired fantastically by getting drawing more attention to the woolliness of the exception and making doctors more frightened. So to bring us up to date for one of the big cases behind the recent reform, was that of Sarah Ewart.
Yes.
In 2013, Sarah Ewart experienced at about 20 weeks scan a diagnosis of anencephaly, which is incompatibility with life. Hers was a very much wanted pregnancy. And like myself, until somebody asked me to think about it, she'd never thought about this. She'd never looked into abortion.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply to me is kind of a generic phrase until it does.
Of course, yeah.
And she was shocked in 2013 to discover that in her own country, she's from Belfast, and in her own country, having a diagnosis of fatal fetal abnormality at 20 weeks, that she was expected to carry on until 40 weeks and deliver her, would have been a stillborn child without all of its development complete. She didn't know that.
Yeah.
She didn't know that was the law until it happened to her. So she had to travel to Britain her decision was that she could not wait another 20 weeks knowing that this was not going to end well for herself or for the child. So she travelled to Britain and she came back and she spoke publicly about it, and that drew a lot of attention to it. And that was around the same time as Savita Halappanavar died in the Republic of Ireland.
I remember both cases were...
The overlap is that Savita's doctors were also too frightened to intervene in time to save her life. Savita's was 17 weeks pregnant in Galway Hospital, and because her fetus still had a heartbeat, the doctors were working on the same absolute ban. There was a few exceptions for the risk to the mother's life.
But because there was still a heartbeat detected.
Because there was still a heartbeat, even though that the septicemia was ravaging her, they delayed treating her because of fear of this legislation, which could put them in prison for life. And had they acted sooner, she would have been alive today. There is no question of that.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, that was one blatant example of a woman's life was lost. And then another woman with a fatal fetal abnormality was expected to carry that pregnancy another 20 weeks to deliver, and the grief of that and the difficulty of that. And she went to Britain and came back and made herself available to activists to talk to and to bring. And that's one of the highlights behind the reforms.
The momentum here. And I remember her mother as well and her family members really supporting her and speaking out. And of course, Amnesty and various organisations got involved. So from a campaigning perspective, and to draw attention to the fact that you say most people, don't think about it, whether they want to or not, or if it doesn't affect them. But Sarah Ewart was so brave, really, to bring her own personal tragedy there, and the stress and the sheer trauma of what she had gone through. And like you said, the shock and realisation that this is her country and, she can't get the medical care that she actually needed.
Do you know what is quite ironic, and I need to point this out? Before the scary guidance of 2013, doctors were performing terminations for the exact case that Sarah had under the old law, because to continue the pregnancy would have made her a physical mental wreck. Well, she did satisfy that criteria.
Absolutely.
And she satisfied the criteria of long-term permanent damage to her mental health.
Yeah.
But because of the guidance, which we'd fought so hard for, they were too frightened to do it.
So interesting.
So the strategy backfired spectacularly, in my opinion, because it drew attention to these issues and made doctors more frightened.
So Sarah then, a little bit later, moving on, began her High Court challenge, then Eileen, in 2019.
There's a bit in between. There's the part in between. The Northern Ireland Assembly had the power from 2010 to change this law because it was given justice powers.
Right.
Justice powers, the making of laws, these kind of laws were not, they used to be reserved to Westminster, but in 2010 they became within the remit of the Northern Ireland Assembly.
I see.
So in 2016, there was a debate in the Assembly in which these kind of exceptional cases, fetal abnormality and sexual crime, rape, incest, were put before the Assembly on the 10th of February. They voted against any change.
Wow.
So when people come, as I will be talking now about the Westminster change, when people say, this was not the role of Westminster, this was the role of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the Northern Ireland Assembly had the opportunity.
Yeah.
And in more limited circumstances than now we have, and they turned it down by a vote.
10 years ago.
Well, 2016, 4 years ago. 4 years ago, before the suspension of the Assembly for 3 years,
of course,
they voted down more limited reforms than we got this year. And I just need to point that out. Had the Northern Ireland Assembly gone for more limited reforms, what happened in the subsequent years with Westminster intervening and CEDAW intervening would not have happened.
And just sticking with Northern Ireland, 2 years later, so 2018, we saw some change and some movement, both within the Assembly, but also following on from the UK Supreme Court decision, which kind of led on to Sarah Ewart's case later on.
Yes.
So
I'll talk about that. Okay, so that's the human rights angle. There's several angles here, and this is a human rights angle. Under the European Convention of Human Rights, which is not, for your listeners, anything to do with the European Union, just let me make that clear. The European Convention on Human Rights, which was drafted and passed after the Second World War, there is Article 8, the right to private and family life. And there have been series of decisions by that court that, not to say that there was a direct right to abortion, but there was a right for the state not to interfere with your decisions on private and family life and reproductive issues such as whether to become a parent or not to become a parent were interpreted as falling under that. So therefore, it was the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission that took this case in 2015 originally, saying that they believed the unclear and restrictive Northern Irish abortion law, which had no exceptions for fetal abnormalities or sexual crime, breached Article 8. And the High Court in Belfast in 2015 said that's right, and they agreed with them. However, there was the Attorney General who was very vocal in his anti-choice views. He appealed that case and it was lost then at the higher court. So the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said there is no specific victim here.
Mm-hmm.
And had there been a specific victim, they would have said that it breached Article 8 rights. So that's where Sarah Ewart comes in. Sarah Ewart put herself forward as the victim, and that's that terminology for legal people. There has to be a rights bearer whose rights have been breached.
So she had the standing.
She
in
had
this
standing.
case.
It's called locus standi. She had the standing, and she put herself forward. Now, by the time her case was heard on the 3rd of October last year, there was another process already on its way through, which meant her case was slightly less outstanding than it would have been, and I'll explain that in a minute. But Sarah Ewart, in that case, it was said that the lack of provision for her case, as in a fetal abnormality, the lack of provision under the Northern Irish abortion law meant that it would breach Article 8.
Mm-hmm.
Now, had other things not been happening at that time, Sarah, that would have been a big Roe v. Wade case. Yes, it would have been. Yes, it would have been a standout case. Yes. It would have been a massive case. However, 3 weeks after the judgment was issued, we were to get a new law anyway. So I'll revert to that if you want to.
Yes, please.
You want to ask me about that? Okay.
Yeah.
In 2018, after a very long process where activists from Northern Ireland, women's rights activists from various organisations, had gone to the committee which oversees the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. That's a UN convention.
The CEDAW.
CEDAW, also known as CEDAW.
Mm-hmm.
CEDAW had a procedure where activists and people from any states that were breaching its rights, which are enumerated women's rights, could approach the committee with evidence. And the committee, they had done this starting back in 2010. And the committee came to Northern Ireland and interviewed people about the provision of abortion or the lack of provision of abortion or the impact of it. And in 2018, CEDAW published a report, a very significant report, saying that the UK government were responsible for grave and systematic breaches of women's human rights in their lack of provision for abortion in cases of rape, incest and fetal abnormalities. That was really laid down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, CEDAW came out with some other recommendations. It recommended in 2018 that the UK remove the abortion ban in those cases, and that it takes away criminalisation of women who were accessing abortions illegally. Okay. So women were accessing abortions through receiving pills on the internet from established organisations that had been set up to do this.
Yes.
Such as Women on Web. There used to be, it was originally Women on Waves, run by a Dutch doctor called Rebecca Gromperts, where they actually had ships in the off territorial waters conducting abortions. But then they started to provide pills online. So CEDAW recommended end to prosecutions for people having abortions in these circumstances, suspending all ongoing prosecutions, removal of the abortion ban from the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. They also recommended other things. And 2 of those other things are really significant, Sarah. One of them is the establishment of bubble zones around abortion facilities, so preventing protesters harassing women using them, and also preventing them from harassing the staff, the clinic staff. And the other thing they recommended, this is just my shortened version, was a reform of the sex education system in schools.
Vital.
So that the children would understand from an early age that understand this issue from a scientific point of view, and that they would get accurate scientific education about contraception and reproductive issues like this. So those two things have not so far appeared in Northern Irish legislation, but we'll just put that to the side for the moment because it is there. But what happened next was, it was not then the responsibility of Northern Ireland to do anything about it, because Northern Ireland has not signed up to CEDAW. The UK has.
So it went to the Commons then, isn't that right?
It was on the UK government to make these changes. It was not upon Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland does not sign human rights treaties for itself. It doesn't have the power to do so. So so even with that, it took a lot of activist lawyers and medics to get that report, get CEDAW to look at this issue and to issue that report. Then it took some activist politicians to get it on the agenda at the House of Commons. And the person was Stella Creasy MP.
I remember.
She added on, she proposed an amendment to the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Bill in 2019, whereby Section 9 of that bill was putting a legal obligation on the government to fulfil CEDAW's recommendations. And of course, in the House of Commons, which has 650 MPs from diverse backgrounds, it passed on the 9th of July 2019. Now, there was uproar among a lot of politicians in Northern Ireland who described themselves as pro-life. Because they said Westminster, this is quite ironic, this is the most ironic part of it, a lot of them were unionists.
I can sense the irony.
A lot of unionist politicians decried the involvement of the Westminster Parliament in Northern Ireland affairs, which is quite shocking. It's actually quite shocking to say that we want to be in a union with you and we believe in this Parliament, but we don't want you to work on issues such as international human rights.
But when it comes to Brexit, it's okay.
When it comes to Brexit,
you take the lead.
Absolutely fine. Whatever you want goes.
Yeah.
We will, it was so, I dare say, Trumpian. It's almost quite Donald Trumpian. This, count the votes that go for me and don't count those that go against me. So it was really, so they were saying Westminster has no business in Northern Ireland affairs. And the answer to that was, when it comes to human rights, we have absolute responsibility for human rights in your jurisdiction. For example, can you imagine tomorrow that the Northern Ireland Assembly came up with, passed a law saying no gays in the military?
Absolutely.
That's a human rights issue. And Northern Ireland would not be allowed to do that.
No.
They're not allowed to make blatantly abusive human rights laws. And however, now I have to acknowledge there are people out there listening to this who may not agree with the topic itself. They may think that there are other human rights involved in the abortion debate. And if they are activist lawyers in themselves, they have every right to argue that.
Absolutely.
But what I will give you now is a little sum up of the human rights issues here then. So there are people that say you haven't, the UK government has not considered the rights of the fetus, the right to life of the unborn. And what I will say is the UK signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights. And there is a long history of that court making decisions about whether the right to life extends to what they would call the unborn. And there has never been a definite, there's never been an acceptance of that.
Yeah.
Even in a case, it was called Vaux v. France, where a doctor negligently performed an abortion on the wrong woman in the waiting room. She did not pass the human rights test for her, as she called, unborn child to have rights.
Right.
The right to life does not extend to you until you're born. And that is consistent. So when I'm not saying those rights have not been considered. They have been considered by the court.
Yeah.
But the court has never given, the European Court of Human Rights has never given the right to life to any citizen before they're born.
This podcast is sponsored by Granite Exchange. Do you need an office or a meeting room space? Granite Exchange is the ultimate serviced office and meeting room facility. Located in the heart of Newry City, it is perfectly placed between Belfast and Dublin. Each office suite is fully furnished and comes with an all-inclusive monthly fee with no long-term contract. All you have to do is show up and switch on. The rest is taken care of. For more information, call 028 3044 2500 or visit www.granite-exchange.com.
So where we are now is that up until this point, we have agreed to sign up to this convention. We have agreed to allow this court to interpret those rights.
Yes.
And they have interpreted the Article 8 right to private and family life as requiring the state not to intervene. So Stella Creasy's amendment, back to that, basically it said, you're under a duty to reform this law.
Yeah.
The Stormont Assembly was not running since the end of 2017. Well, start 2018. And the actual part of the legislation that Stella Creasy was involved in gave the Northern Ireland Assembly until the 21st of October 2019 to get back to work, to address this itself. But at the stroke of midnight, if they had not done so, this law was coming into force. And the law that I'm talking about is the one that reformed the ban, took away the criminalisation of women, and introduced the possibility of new regulations. And the regulations, which we'll talk about after.
The legalisation. But Eileen, there were attempts to block
This, yes.
that.
There was an attempt. Now, when I say an attempt, Sarah, it was a theatrical attempt. And this is why I'm speaking about the topic. Because we've seen a lot of theatrical attempts in the last 3 weeks in the US election.
We have.
And what I mean by that is an attempt that has no basis in law, no basis in an ability to change the law, but is very done for the purposes of gathering support amongst people and to bring media attention. Now, on the 20th, it was the day before the deadline, several parties defining themselves as pro-life turned up at Stormont and talked about this new bill which Stormont was going to pass in opposition to the law that was about to come in at midnight, reforming abortion law, and it was called Defence of the Unborn. Now, the Assembly works according to established procedures that we've all signed up to and we all agree to and we all depend upon. Bit like elections. You know, when you are voting in an election, you're accepting a certain procedure. I accept that things happen a certain way, whether it goes for me or against me. The Assembly works in that way. Those who turned up at the Assembly on that day proclaiming that they were going to pass another law for Northern Ireland to protect the fetus had not done any work to fulfil the procedures to elect a speaker.
Right. So it was bluster.
There was nothing they could physically do in law, but they did get a lot of media attention.
They did, I remember.
And
as
they
well.
misled
There
the
were
public.
crowds.
This is a bit like
Yeah.
Donald Trump misleading the public, making them think that there's still a possibility for him to be president. Misleading the public thinking, we can change this, we can change it. No, you can't. You had
Yeah.
3 years to change it. You voted against it when you had the opportunity. You voted down more limited reforms than the ones that are coming in at midnight. You had the chance, and if you were serious, you would have sorted out your differences, elected a
advance.
speaker,
Yeah.
and got back in there and made your own laws. Turning up, you know, as the clock ticks down to midnight with no actual procedure in place to do it, was misleading the public,
Yeah,
and that's one of the
absolutely.
reasons I'm passionate about this
Yeah.
debate.
So, and that's pretty recent. So that was last year.
Yes.
So where are we now, Eileen,
Okay.
with that? I
So
mean,
that
in practice. as
in
well.
practice, decriminalisation happened on that day.
Right.
The 1861 Act, Offences Against the Person Act, the sections banning abortion in Northern Ireland were removed. For Northern Ireland only, they still exist in England, and that's another anomaly. That's quite anomalous. But for Northern Ireland only, they were. So the first thing that happened was they were removed.
Right.
The next thing that happened was existing prosecutions against a mother for trying to get pills for her daughter online. That prosecution was dropped. The next thing that happened was a set of regulations were brought in. After a consultation. There was a short consultation in Northern Ireland, and the consultation was about how to implement CEDAW, not whether to. So how to implement the CEDAW that I talked about earlier.
Yes.
Not whether we should.
Yeah.
But a lot of the responses were generic, and they were written by churches and handed out in church halls, hallways, doorways. And they did not answer the question asked. So a lot of them said this shouldn't be happening when it was already happening legally. So what we've got now are the Abortion Northern Ireland Regulations 2020. Came into effect 31st of March. They said access to abortion up to 12 weeks is permitted on request. So similar to the Republic of Ireland.
Yes.
12 weeks upon request. This is something which in 2018 Sinn Féin changed its policy to allow.
That's right.
And that's an example of that. After 12 weeks, abortion is permitted up to 24 weeks gestation, same as England and Wales and Scotland, where the continuance of the pregnancy involved a risk greater to the physical or mental health of the woman than if the pregnancy were terminated. So similar again to the Abortion Act in Great Britain. Beyond that, terminations to save the life of the woman or to prevent grave permanent injury are permitted with no gestational limit, as are those in the cases of severe fetal impairment or fatal fetal abnormality. So, a new, more liberal abortion law. However,
Yes. How has it been in practice?
However, I predicted this when I was writing a blog about it in February. Those regulations give power to the Northern Ireland Minister of Health, who is Robin Swan, UUP, to commission abortion services because they must be conducted on Health and Social Care Trust premises. And he's responsible for the delivery of health services in Northern Ireland. We've seen an awful lot of them because of the pandemic.
That's right.
I predicted that he would not automatically work to provide these services.
So he wouldn't commission.
He
them or
wouldn't
deliver.
actively commission to deliver services. Now, I predicted that, but I didn't predict the pandemic.
No.
The pandemic coincided 1 week before the pandemic, 1 week before the regulations came into force. Boris Johnson locked us all down, told us to stay at home. 1 week. So, even though abortions became legal in Northern Ireland on the 31st of March, women were issued with a phone number saying, organise your termination in England. We don't have any abortion services in Northern Ireland. And that happened on 1 week after we were told to stay at home. We were told to not go near our health services. We were not told not to go to our doctors, not to go to A&E unless we were dying. And there were reports of 2 women suicide attempts.
Oh, gosh.
Because they could not get travelling to Britain.
Travel.
Yes. So first of all, Robin Swan was very busy. In his defence, he was very busy with the pandemic. But he did not take on his role. That's the first thing. He did not engage with this role. It is arguable, had there been a Minister for Health from a different party who was more accepting of the changes that had come in, that they would have used their power to commission services. Right? What he has done, and this is the most misleading thing, and this is why I'm speaking today, because I have a passion to inform people correctly with the correct information. He has said he needed executive approval, i.e. he needed all the other ministers and the executive to agree. Nowhere in the regulations does it say that. The Department of Health has also now said it's not our responsibility to commission these services. And we need a public consultation on commissioning these services. Nowhere in the regulations or in the Act which gave rise to the regulations or in the report of CEDAW which gave rise to the Act which gave rise to the regulations does this exist.
Okay.
So here is a minister from a party that does not have a pro-choice position actively, or no, let's say passively.
Yeah.
Passively in one sense, not fulfilling what's expected of him by the law, and then actively misleading the public as to think they have another say into where abortions would take place. It's completely contradictory.
Yeah.
I'll tell you why it's contradictory, because there was 2 statements by the Department of Health, and one said it's not our job. It's not our responsibility to commission abortion services. And in the other paragraph it said, but abortion services can only be carried out on our premises. So if it's not your role and they can only be done on your premises, what are you saying?
Yeah. And this is in direct contravention of all of the recommendations.
Yes.
I mean, surely, Eileen, there's going to be more case law around
There's got
this.
to be.
There has to be.
I'll tell you why. In 2006, the European Court of Human Rights, that one that we're still signed up to because it has nothing to do with the European Union or has nothing to do with Brexit.
Let that be noted.
Let that be noted again. In 2006, there was a case which said that it is a breach of Women's Article 8 human rights to prevent the access and availability to abortions in countries where they are legal. So if you have legal abortion, to then go about making it inaccessible through lack of provision, you're still breaching human rights. So there will be another case, because at the minute there's no impetus on Robin Swan to do his job. Now, the job has been done by others, if I can go into that.
Yes, of course.
The organisations that got involved, even in the CEDAW inquiry, have been active in getting sexual and reproductive health clinics to offer abortions up till 10 weeks. Now, those are the clinics where people would go for tests, for example. GUM clinics, they used to call them. They're now called SRH clinics. So those clinics throughout Northern Ireland have of their own volition, not required, not asked to do this by Robin Swan, of their own volition, they have started offering early medical abortions. And what that means is abortions by using 2 sets of pills.
Okay.
And those have been available in those clinics during the pandemic.
But surgical procedures
No
are
surgical,
not
none.
provided
None.
throughout
So
Northern Ireland.
you can, those EMA, I'm just going to call them EMA from now on, also known as the abortion pill, is available up to 10 weeks.
Okay.
And now there's one issue. There is no public information about that. The Department of Health has not, I mean, I know this because I do research in the area. Because I talk to the task force. I do the research. You will also find information on it on a website called Informing Choices NI, which was the new name for the Family Planning Association of Northern Ireland. So the 5 trusts were offering these in their clinics, their sexual and reproductive health clinics, until the Northern Trust became overwhelmed in October.
Okay.
And the Northern Trust had to say, unfortunately, we can no longer provide early medical abortion up to 10 weeks because we've got no space, we've got no room, we can't do it. So they are available in the other 4 trusts. However, people don't know that widely. It's not widely. There's been no public information campaign about that.
There's nothing.
And still, if people don't know that, they will turn to the internet potentially to get. So for a lot of people, so the only people for whom anything has changed is those who find out about that and are under 10 weeks. If you're between 10 and 12 weeks, there's still a possibility of having that done with medical help at the clinic.
Okay.
But the activists involved in this wanted what happened in the UK and in the Republic of Ireland. They wanted what they called telemedicine, which is for the pills to be issued to your home, for the consultation to be done online or by telephone. I mean, I haven't seen a doctor since March. For any reason. A lot of people are engaging with their doctors over the phone, and they don't go to the clinic. You're told not to go to your clinic.
Yeah.
You're told to ring your doctor. So what the activists wanted, Alliance for Choice being the leading organisation, they have argued for telemedicine, which is for women to be able to ring up to get the pills sent out to them and take them in the comfort of their own home and not have to attend a clinic at all. Now, that was allowed in England, Scotland and Wales, and I believe in the Republic of Ireland. The only place in the British Isles where that's not happening during the pandemic is Northern Ireland.
Right.
And I suppose the only question is, what are the reasons for that? Well, the legislation says it must be done on trust facilities in NHS grounds. If safety is not the reason, what is the reason?
Yeah.
You know, and if it's safe enough to do in Wales, Scotland, England, why not here? And again, there's this imagery in Northern Ireland of having to overcome hurdles and obstacles. And that's still there, Sarah.
Yeah.
That's still there, regardless of the reforms. There was a story of one woman who was taking an 8-hour ferry to Liverpool from Belfast during the pandemic, and you have to go to the clinic in Britain on 2 separate occasions, and there was no accommodation available. There was no hotels, there was no B&Bs. So whether you agree with this area of law or not, whether you agree with the liberalisation of abortion law, what you need to take away from this talk is, even when the law is changed and written on paper, in some circumstances you cannot depend upon that.
Yeah.
You
Well,
can't depend upon what's written in front of you. And if that was in any other area of law or life, for example, education, if that was in the area of education and a minister refused to provide services, so, you know, technically the state's not stopping you from getting an education, but we're not going to build a school.
No.
And we're not going to give any money towards any schools or any initiatives. So have an education all you want, but don't expect us to give you a school.
In law it's there, but it's not accessible.
I think what it shows is a bigger problem with what human rights mean in their legal conceptualization.
Yeah.
Human rights that evolved after Second World War were civil and political rights, and they were very negative in nature. What they meant was, the state cannot prevent you from doing X, Y, and Z. The state should not prevent you. You have freedom from. Freedom from does not mean access to. You know,
a different
I have
language.
the freedom to buy a mansion tomorrow. We all have.
Yeah.
They say that the rich as well as the poor have the right to sleep under bridges. You know, it's about, human rights are very much about freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of this, freedom of that. When it comes to reproductive rights, you need services.
Yeah.
When it comes to health and education, you need services, you need funding. And human rights, and in their original conception of negative freedoms from, do not actually provide for that.
Yeah.
So despite the big human rights challenges and CEDAW and Sarah Ewert's case, no one would be getting any abortions in Northern Ireland if it were not for activists, activist doctors, activists, clinicians, nurses in those clinics who have of their own volition added to their workload and saying, we'll do this.
Yeah.
And they are making this reform real, but they can only do it
They
up
can
to
only do so much.
Well, they can't. I mean, they can
well.
only do it up to 10 weeks because it involves handing out pills. Beyond that, there's no
But
services.
that's not satisfactory. on
Well, if
any-
you were Sarah Ewert today, you'd still have to go to Britain.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not satisfactory. And I mean, it's just deeply disappointing on all levels to talk about, you know, the couple of years there where we saw massive change, huge momentum, you know, maybe on the back of what happened in the Republic of Ireland, that momentum carried forward somewhat. I know it was in completely different circumstances. And we had the involvement of Westminster there that you mentioned. But to get to that point, and I know the pandemic, you know, bad timing in every respect, it's bad timing, but particularly there when it came at that kind of crux when, you know, the law had reformed essentially. But it's so disappointing, even on a political level, not to see anybody really. And I mean, you might be aware, Eileen, of people who are actively, I know of a few names, maybe kind of more fringe parties that are still very active around this issue and not letting it drop.
Claire Bailey of the Green Party would not let this drop in a million years.
Yeah.
No way. I mean, that's an example of a very, you know, obvious pro-choice party, but Sinn Féin reformed their position. I wrote a very interesting article about that before they reformed their position, but then they did reform their position because they couldn't have a different law north and south. They had to have consistent policy north and south. But there is an argument that if Alliance, for example, had got the Ministry for Health, they would have done something with this. It would have been a
different story.
Yes, or if Sinn Féin had got it, they would have done a different story. But you can't predict that.
No, you can't. And you have, I mean, activists like Goretti, Horgan, and a lot of the BPP, you know what I mean, really still putting this out there.
Well, the BPAS, the British Pregnancy Association, started in the pandemic to email pills out to women in Northern Ireland. Because that would come under an emergency situation under the new regulations, because from the day they came into force, on day one there was no services, and you were told not to travel, and there were no flight. There were flights for like £600 because there were so very few flights to Britain. So they started to actually provide pills to women in Northern Ireland. So. I say in the big picture, this particular strategy with these organisations, from the Family Planning Association in 2001 to Alliance for Choice, and they've been doing this for quite a long time now as well, over 12, 15 years I've been seeing that. There's been so much activism, there's been so much pressure, there's been so many cases, and yet still on the ground, the reality is things are similar to what they were. The biggest change is you can no longer be sent to prison for life.
So the criminal
for having a termination in Northern Ireland illegally. And there is now one thing, there is still an offence for any medic that goes against the regulations and does their own thing. But that really only applies where there's conditions, and that's after the 12 weeks. But that was, again, there's still a wee bit of criminal activity in there, which was not meant to be there because CEDAW recommended removing all criminal sanctions from this area. The background to this, Sarah, is, and it's really important for the listeners, in no country in the world where abortion is illegal does it stop women or pregnant people attempting to have abortions when they feel they have no other option in their lives.
Yeah.
If the law preventing abortions worked, I could see into it. I understand that people have those views.
Yeah.
But abortion laws that prohibit abortions only drive abortions underground and criminalise people, and potentially in some countries. Now, those pills issued by the BPAS and Women on the Web are safe, absolutely safe. I'm not saying that. But in the past, prohibitions on abortions don't stop abortions. They just create health problems. They create unsafe health problems. I mean, if they changed the problem, I could see.
Aye.
But that's the point. I mean, it doesn't stop. What you're trying to stop can only be stopped by adequate sex education, adequate free and easy access to contraception and information about preventing unwanted pregnancies. That's how you stop
Yeah.
You do really heavy abortion laws.
Which beggars belief that still isn't in place. And I mean, it's there as a recommendation. You noted it there as part of the CEDAW recommendation.
Yes.
I remember in the Republic of Ireland, that was very much fed into the discussion it always has around abortion. Well, you know, as an alternative, or not an alternative, but to kind of, you bring it in line, bring it into the education system to educate young people. They didn't want to touch it.
No.
And the same here. I mean, it'll be a long time, I would imagine, before that gets brought on. But it makes sense.
Yeah.
But it seems to be that the start of our conversation, people not wanting to talk about it and to turn a blind eye. And as you say,
well, it's a human rights matter. I was basically forced into this topic against my will.
You're not alone.
Against my will.
I come from a similar background to you, and it was only when I went off to college and I started hearing about cases, and I thought, my goodness, I really wasn't aware. And I became involved with work with the National Women's Council of Ireland. And even then, I had my eyes opened to so much.
Yeah.
But it's a process and a journey that we've been brought on.
Yes.
And many people have as well.
Yes.
And just on that basis, we've spoken about the law, the recommendations, the position we're in now, which is disappointing, frankly, in Northern Ireland. But just in terms of public perception, Eileen, and maybe what happened a couple of years ago in the Republic of Ireland, is there a wave? Are people starting to come out and talk about it? Because we were two very different positions. In the Republic, we had all of the conversations. They had focus groups, they had round table discussions about it. I remember meeting with people who had a certain opinion, and a few weeks later they were brought around and their opinion changed because they met with people who had, you know, personal lived experiences. We never had that opportunity in Northern Ireland.
I was involved for a few years, from 2010 to 13, in an education project throughout Northern Ireland for Alliance for Choice, educating women on their human rights more generally and on this aspect of them.
Okay.
But that was a project that I was involved in. Again, I think they're still continuing it, but a short period I was involved in. So that started 10 years ago. I do think there's an urban-rural split.
Right.
And this is my second conversation on this topic in Newry. And I've lived here for quite a while. I've done a lot of this work in Belfast. There's a lot of this work in Belfast, in our area. I'm very glad to be talking about it in this area, because this is, Newry is a city, but there's a surrounding rural community. And it's, again, I can't blame those people for experiencing this as a taboo when that's where I was before I started to learn about it, because I had done 4 years of a law degree and I still didn't want to talk about it. So I don't blame people for wanting to stay away from it. I actually had a conversation with my nephew last week, and I said to him, I really want you to watch a documentary on ITV called America's War on Abortion to see where I'm coming from.
Yes.
And there are scenes in that documentary that I really would love people to watch. They are quite disturbing scenes. They are people standing outside abortion clinics in America wearing red "Make America Great Again" hats, calling women going into the clinics the most vile names, and harassing the staff. And these are big clinics where people are going in for lots of different reasons.
Yeah,
there's
nobody
people going
knows
in
what
for,
they're going
there's
in for.
people going in for their 12-week scans.
Yeah.
There's people going in for their 20-week
And how
scans.
traumatising for anybody, no matter what you're going in
I
for.
challenge you, anybody who's listening, to go to the ITV player and look up America's War on Abortion and watch it. And then come back to us and say, do you not think something needs to be, this conversation needs to be had?
It needs to be had. It started, I think.
Yeah.
And it started here, Eileen. And you're right. I mean, you can feel a little bit isolated at times because it's not something that you can just bring up and talk to. And people have their own very personal views, and we're respectful of that as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, something has to be done. And the fact that here, I mean, I think what listeners should take away with today is Eileen's gone through the legal changes and the reforms. The law has changed.
The law has changed.
But nothing has changed on the ground in that sense.
The one thing that has changed is that you will not be prosecuted if you buy pills online from those.
Which is quite significant.
And also, you can go to your sexual reproductive health clinic in your local area and request early medical abortion up to 10 weeks.
Yeah.
And if you need more information about any of these issues, Informing Choices NI website will lead you to the right place.
Fantastic.
But really, again, it's a very interesting topic to see how you depend upon the laws that you are able to look up to work.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was in any other area, you wouldn't be happy that they didn't work. So this is just another example.
Another area, another example. But Eileen, look, it's been just fantastic. That's such a wealth of information, for anybody to get their heads around. But we will stay in touch with you because I am sure over the next few months, your work will lead you down different paths as well. And I suppose this will continue. I mean, it won't stop. And as you say, activists are still continuing on the ground to push for this matter, and it won't go away. And people should really be able to access their rights that are now laid down by law.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for coming in and sharing that with us. We look forward to having you in again. It's been fantastic.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
So thank you, listeners, today for tuning into this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. My name's Sarah Henry and it's been The Activist Lawyer. You can check us out on www.activistlawyer.com, where we will be publishing some blogs and some written pieces as well. And if you have any questions or want to find out how to get involved, contact us through our social media pages as well. Thank you for tuning in. Bye.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.